My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. In a very strange case, the first and only Hey Arnold game was based on the Hey Arnold film. Despite being a pretty solid success for Nick, so much so that they released a film in theaters, it took until the franchise was winding down for a game to be made. Much like Jimmy Neutron, which I covered last week, the birth of Hey Arnold has its roots way back in the 80s. Series creator Craig Bartlett, who is actually the brother-in-law of Matt Groening, was working on Pee-wee's Playhouse. In 1987, he created some claymation cutaways for that show about a character named Penny and her friend Arnold. All up, there would be 3 shorts created using this Arnold character. 6 years after he came up with what was essentially a throwaway idea at the time, Bartlett found himself teaming up with 5 writers from the Rugrats to develop animation projects for Nickelodeon. Unfortunately, this team was a disaster. Pitch meetings with Nick ended in frustration as none of their ideas seemed to go very far. As a last-ditch effort, Bartlett dug out tapes of the Penny claymation shorts, intending to pitch something around this character. To his surprise, the Nick execs were more interested in the Arnold character, which all of a sudden got the ball rolling. In 1994, Bartlett created the pilot episode of Hey Arnold. Nickelodeon signed off on it, and the series was put into production. Fun fact, the pilot episode of Hey Arnold was screened in theaters before Nick's debut theatrical film, Harriet the Spy. Soon after, on October 7, 1996, Arnold made its debut. From there, it would air 5 seasons, finishing up in June of 2004. The end of Arnold's development was actually quite rocky, much of it stemming from the fallout of the movie this game is based on. Because of this, it took 4 years for every episode of the final season to air on US television. On May 31, 2002, roughly a month before the film's release, Hey Arnold the movie released on the GBA. Developed by Altron, longtime fans of the channel will recognise them from the very first Cartoon Network game, Dexter's Lab Robot Rampage, as well as Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi Kaznapped, which is a super underrated game. However, their development history is tied far more heavily to Nickelodeon. They'll go on to develop Fairly Odd Parents Enter the Cleft, Rocket Power's Zero Gravity Zone, All Grown Up Express Yourself, Nicktoons Freeze Frame Frenzy, both Danny Phantom games, Tak the Great Juju Challenge, Drawn to Life SpongeBob Edition, Atlantis Square Pantis, and Truth or Square. And now I'm out of breath. While I've really enjoyed the 2 Altron games I've played so far, critics were just as harsh on Hey Arnold's video game debut as they were on his film debut. The disappointing 5.2 average review score only adds to the pain and misery the franchise was succumbing to around this time. Hey Arnold wasn't really a show I was heavily into, but let's have a look and see what this football head's all about. The structure of Hey Arnold the movie sees you going into 5 different worlds, for lack of a better term, each filled with 4 stages to play through. Naturally, you're playing as Arnold, but you'll also get to take control of Gerald and Arnold's grandparents. For whatever reason, every single character plays and controls exactly the same. I always get a good chuckle when devs do this. Like, what's the point? Might as well just make me play the whole game as Arnold. I'm glad that they didn't have me playing as Gerald in the level where the fucking SWAT team is spraying water cannons at you though. Obvious to anybody with eyes, we've got a 2D platformer here. Platforming controls really well here, in all honesty. I don't recall a single time where I got frustrated with how it handled. Like any true 2D platformer, there's a crap ton of collectibles, in this case footballs, that give you an extra life when you grab 100. Your default attack with Arnold is throwing a piece of gum. The other characters have an attack styled after them, but the attack still functions exactly the same. This attack is pretty pathetic and makes the game a bit of a slog. Instead of wiping out enemies, it merely stuns them for a very brief moment. It felt like the entire game was going to be a slog because of this, but you quickly discover the game has a collection of power-ups, a couple of which are more powerful attacks. The tomatoes are a spread-based attack and will stun enemies for longer, while the basketball will straight up murder anybody foolish enough to get in your way. In addition to this, there are also power-ups that increase your power, giving the gum and tomatoes greater effect. Then there's power-ups for speed and jump height. All of them are really useful. In fact, they're so useful and I'd argue so necessary to the game experience that playing without them is a chore. Dying makes you lose every single one of your newfound abilities, resetting the game to being a slog. Thankfully, the power-ups do carry over from level to level. Way too many games just arbitrarily set you back to default when moving to new levels, so I'm glad Ultron at least didn't fall for that. In my opinion, Hey Arnold is best played with save states acting as your checkpoints. Not because it's super hard or anything, but because the game is infinitely more fun in your powered up state. It doesn't make the experience a walk in the park. You'll still screw up regularly while in your souped up form, but the game just feels like it was meant to be played with all the bells and whistles attached. As you leave a trail of death across the city via basketballs, you have different objectives you need to complete. Sometimes the game is a straight A to B platformer, but more often than not there's some tedious objective tacked on. I have no idea why the developers of licensed games are so against making a simple platformer. There's always got to be some annoying extra caveat, or heaven forbid, they make a goddamn Lost Vikings clone. Here's a sample of some of the annoying objectives found throughout Hey Arnold. In one level you have to deliver flyers into mailboxes. The flyers act as your weapon and you also have to throw them into the mailbox, meaning you can waste the limited ammo you're given. The game allows you to refill your flyers, but of course you have to backtrack to do this. I ran out of flyers and had to trudge all the way back to the start of the level, only to find out that about halfway through the level, Arnold breaks the space-time continuum and has somehow teleported an entire building across the city. This was beyond annoying. Also, I missed a single mailbox and had to backtrack around to find it. Not fun. Then there's the classic find X amount of items scattered throughout the level. This also inevitably results in backtracking. There's a level where you literally just have to search through filing cabinets, and then the final stage randomly throws in a level where you drive a bus. All of these levels are infinitely worse than the ones where you're just jumping and shooting your way from start to finish. I seriously wouldn't have had basically anything to complain about if they just kept things simple. As is tradition for these kinds of licensed games, the final level of each stage is a boss battle. I'm sure you're extremely surprised to hear that not a single one of these is enjoyable. The final boss battle is particularly annoying as there's no pattern to his movements. You're basically just winging it the entire time, hoping that his erratic movements will match up with your own movements. Looking back at my experience with Hey Arnold after finishing the game, the one thought that kept popping into my head is the seriously missed potential here. This game is basically everything I dislike about 2D licensed games bundled into one package. Literally every pet peeve I have can be found here in some format. And the even crazier thing is, I still kind of enjoyed the game. At the heart of it, there's a really fun 2D platformer here. I just had to deal with a million minor issues chipping away at me. If it had just been a normal 2D platformer, I'd be sitting here now praising it just as much as I praised Ultron's Puffy Army Yumi game. Instead, my experience with Hey Arnold was bittersweet. The one genuinely significant issue I had was in one of the levels where you play as Arnold's grandpa. You're supposed to be planting TNT, but no matter what I did, I could not get him to do it. No combination of buttons would prompt him to actually put the TNT down, meaning I couldn't progress. Thankfully, the game has a password system allowing me to just jump a level ahead and keep playing. Visually, I quite liked Hey Arnold. Might not be the very best GBA game I've ever seen, but coming from Jimmy Neutron, this looks like a work of art. Maybe my one criticism from an art and visual design perspective would be the sameness of the environments. This game pretty much takes place in one of three environments: city streets, office buildings, and sewers. The office building levels pile up pretty heavily, and it got to the point towards the end where I was just sick of seeing the same locations over and over. The music gets a tick from me as well. Basically every Nick game has been hitting it out of the park with the music, which is really cool to see. Hey Arnold the movie would be a genuinely great game if it wasn't so ashamed of what it is. This is a brilliant little 2D platformer being dragged down by a lot of unnecessary ideas. It somehow manages to tick every box on the list of Brandon's video game pet peeves, but because the core concept works so well, I'm somehow walking away from this experience not completely hating the game. The potential was here for Hey Arnold to sit atop Nickelodeon Video Game History as one of the standout titles. Instead, a number of clumsy decisions see it tumbling to the middle of the pack. Next time on Nickelodeon Video Game History, we'll have our hands full with another double feature. The GBA and home console versions of Revenge of the Flying Dutchman are vastly different, and the story surrounding the demise of its developer is extremely interesting. Whether those games are good or bad, that's going to be an episode you won't want to miss. The only way to guarantee you'll see it is to hit that subscribe button.